The morning everything fell apart started like any other Tuesday in October. I woke up in my small apartment in Sacramento, California, already calculating how many hours I'd need to work at the diner to make ends meet this month. The math never seemed to add up anymore, no matter how many double shifts I pulled or how many expenses I cut. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I'd been living paycheck to paycheck since I graduated high school 4 years ago. While my friends went off to college with their parents' financial support, I moved into this tiny one-bedroom apartment and started working full-time at Rosie's Diner downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. The cracked bathroom tile, the temperamental heating system, the neighbor's dog that barked at 3 in the morning. I'd grown to love every imperfect detail. My family situation had always been complicated. My parents, Robert and Patricia Chen, had divorced when I was 15, leaving behind a trail of financial chaos and emotional wreckage. Dad disappeared to Arizona with his new girlfriend, sending the occasional birthday card with $20 inside. Mom remarried within a year to a man named Frank, who made it clear that his stepdaughters weren't part of his long-term plans. My younger brother Marcus was the golden child. 3 years younger, but somehow always 3 steps ahead in everyone's eyes. When he joined the Coast Guard right after high school, Mom couldn't stop bragging about her son in uniform. Frank even started calling him the success story of the family. Meanwhile, I was the one they whispered about at family gatherings, the one who couldn't get her life together. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was the one who stayed local, who checked on Mom when she was sick, who helped her move twice when Frank decided he wanted different apartments. But I was also the one they expected to figure everything out alone. That Tuesday morning, I was running late for my shift when I found the envelope slipped under my door. The landlord's office letterhead made my stomach drop before I even opened it. Inside was a notice that my rent check had bounced again, and I had 24 hours to pay the full amount plus late fees or face eviction proceedings. I stared at the numbers, trying to make sense of how my calculations had been so wrong. The bank account I thought had just enough to cover rent was apparently short by $200. Late fees had accumulated over the past 2 months, turning what should have been a manageable situation into an impossible one. My first instinct was to call Mom. Despite everything, she was still my mother, and she'd helped me out of tight spots before. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I tried again an hour later. Then again during my lunch break at the diner. By evening, I'd left 3 messages, each one a little more desperate than the last. When she finally called back, it was nearly midnight. I was sitting on my apartment floor, surrounded by bills and bank statements, trying to find money that simply didn't exist. "Madison, honey, I got your messages." Mom's voice sounded tired, distant. "Look, I talked to Frank about your situation, and we think this might be a good opportunity for you to make some real changes." Changes? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Mom, I'm about to be evicted. I need help, not life advice." "That's exactly what I mean," she continued, and I could hear Frank's voice in the background, coaching her words. "You've been living in that apartment for 3 years, barely scraping by. Maybe losing it is the push you need to find something better, somewhere cheaper. You could move back home for a while, get back on your feet." The offer to move back home might have sounded generous to an outsider, but I knew better. Back home meant Frank's house, where I'd be an unwelcome guest subject to his rules and commentary about my life choices. It meant giving up the independence I'd fought so hard to maintain. "I don't want to move back, Mom. I want to stay in my own place. Can you help me with the rent this month? I can pay you back in 2 weeks when I get my next paycheck." The silence stretched on so long, I thought the call had dropped. Finally, she spoke again, her voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "Madison, I can't keep bailing you out every time you can't manage your finances. Frank and I have our own responsibilities. We're trying to save for retirement, and constantly helping you isn't fair to us." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd asked for help maybe 3 times in 4 years, and each time had paid back every penny. But Frank's influence on my mother had been growing stronger, and his resentment toward her daughters from her first marriage was no secret. "What about Marcus?" I asked, grasping for any alternative. "Can you at least give me his number? Maybe he can help." "Your brother is stationed in Alaska right now," Mom replied quickly. He has his own responsibilities. Besides, he's been working so hard to establish his career in the Coast Guard. I don't think it's fair to burden him with your problems." After she hung up, I sat in the darkness of my apartment, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. The family I'd tried so hard to maintain relationships with had essentially written me off. I was 22 years old, working full-time, and somehow I was still seen as the failure who couldn't get her life together. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of panic and desperate planning. I called my supervisor at the diner, begging for an advance on my paycheck. She was sympathetic but explained that corporate policy didn't allow it. I contacted local assistance programs, but the waiting lists were weeks long. I even swallowed my pride and called my father in Arizona, only to reach a disconnected number. As the eviction deadline approached, I started packing my belongings into garbage bags, accepting the reality that I was about to become homeless. My coworkers at the diner had offered their couches for a few nights, but I knew that was only a temporary solution. The thought of explaining my situation to friends, of admitting that my own family had refused to help me, was almost more devastating than losing my apartment. I was loading the last of my clothes into my car when I heard footsteps on the stairs leading to my apartment. Expecting to see the landlord or a sheriff's deputy, I looked up to find a figure in a Coast Guard uniform climbing toward my door. Marcus stood there, taller and broader than I remembered, his face serious but kind. He was carrying a large envelope and wearing the expression I recognized from our childhood, the look he got when he was determined to fix something that had gone wrong. "Hey sis," he said, his voice gentle despite the authority his uniform commanded. "Mom told me you were having some trouble." Marcus surveyed the chaos of packed bags and boxes scattered around my apartment, his trained eye taking in the situation faster than I could explain it. Without a word, he walked past me and knocked firmly on the landlord's door down the hall. Mr. Peterson emerged, looking annoyed until he saw the uniform. "Sir, I'm Petty Officer Chen," Marcus said, extending his hand with the kind of confidence I'd never possessed. "I understand my sister has been having some difficulties with her rent situation. I'd like to discuss a resolution." What happened next felt like watching someone speak a language I'd never learned. Marcus negotiated with Mr. Peterson using terms like payment plan restructuring and, quote, military family hardship provisions. Within 20 minutes, he'd secured me a 2-week extension and reduced late fees by half. The landlord, who'd barely acknowledged my existence for 3 years, was suddenly treating me with respect simply because my brother wore a uniform. "How did you even know I was in trouble?" I asked as we sat in my kitchen afterward, the eviction notice now feeling less like a death sentence. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me a screenshot of a conversation with our cousin Jessica. She'd seen me crying at the grocery store 3 days earlier and mentioned it to him during one of their regular video calls. While Mom had dismissed my calls for help, Marcus had immediately requested emergency leave and driven 16 hours straight from his base in Kodiak, Alaska. "I've been sending Mom money every month," he said quietly, stirring sugar into the coffee I'd made. "Part of my housing allowance. I thought she was helping you with it." The betrayal hit me like ice water. Our mother had been receiving financial support from Marcus, specifically intended to help the family, but had chosen to keep it for herself and Frank instead of passing any along to me during my struggles. "She never mentioned that," I managed to say, though inside I was screaming. Marcus's jaw tightened. "There's a lot she never mentioned, apparently, like the fact that you've been working 60-hour weeks just to keep this place, or that you've been skipping meals to make rent payments." I hadn't realized he'd noticed my weight loss during our brief video calls over the past year. In the Coast Guard, Marcus had developed skills in observation and problem-solving that our family had never appreciated. While they saw him as their success story, they'd missed the fact that his success included a deep sense of responsibility for the people he cared about. "I have something for you," he said, reaching for the envelope he'd brought. "But first, I need you to understand that accepting this comes with conditions." My heart sank. Even Marcus was going to attach strings to his help. "The conditions aren't what you think," he continued, reading my expression. "The Coast Guard has a program called Military Family Housing Assistance. It's designed to help immediate family members of active duty personnel access affordable housing near military installations." He pulled out a stack of official-looking documents, each bearing the Coast Guard seal and various stamps and signatures. There's a housing complex in Port Angeles, Washington, about 2 hours from my new duty station at Air Station Port Angeles. It's specifically for military families and civilians who work in essential services. The rent is subsidized, utilities are included, and there's job placement assistance for residents. I stared at the papers, trying to process what he was telling me. You want me to move to Washington? I want you to have options that don't involve sleeping in your car or crawling back to Mom and Frank, Marcus said firmly. But here's the thing. This isn't charity. The program requires residents to either work full-time, attend school, or participate in vocational training. There are community service requirements and regular check-ins with a family liaison officer. The papers in front of me outlined a structured program that would provide housing stability while requiring me to work toward longer-term goals. It wasn't a handout. It was a framework for building something better than the paycheck-to-paycheck existence I'd been trapped in. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The apartments are nice, Marcus continued, showing me photos on his phone. 2 bedrooms, full kitchen, laundry hookups. There's a fitness center, community garden, and childcare facilities for residents who need them. The complex is walking distance from downtown Port Angeles, and there are several restaurants and service businesses that actively recruit from the housing program. The opportunity felt too good to be true, but Marcus explained that military family housing programs were designed to address exactly the kind of situation I was facing. Too many service members had family members struggling with housing insecurity, which affected military readiness and morale. What about my job here? I asked, thinking about the diner and the life I'd built in Sacramento. What about it? Marcus asked gently. Madison, you're working 60 hours a week for barely enough money to survive. You have no savings, no benefits, and no path forward. The restaurants in Port Angeles pay better wages, and many offer health insurance and paid time off. He was right, but leaving felt like admitting defeat. This apartment, this job, this life, it was mine. I'd built it without anyone's help, and giving it up felt like surrendering the independence I'd fought so hard to maintain. I know what you're thinking, Marcus said. You think accepting help makes you weak, or that moving away means you failed here. But staying in a situation that's slowly destroying you isn't strength. It's stubbornness. That night, Marcus slept on my couch and spent the evening making phone calls to coordinate the housing application process. I listened to him speaking with various military personnel and housing coordinators, his voice carrying an authority and competence that reminded me how far he'd come since joining the Coast Guard. While he handled logistics, I found myself looking around my apartment with fresh eyes. The cracked bathroom tile I'd grown to love was actually a health hazard. The temperamental heating system had left me freezing through multiple winters. The neighbor's barking dog was just one symptom of a building where management didn't care about tenant quality of life. I'd been so focused on maintaining my independence that I'd convinced myself that struggling was the same as succeeding. The next morning, Marcus drove me to the post office to overnight the completed housing application. The process had been surprisingly straightforward. Marcus's active duty status and my demonstrated work history made me an ideal candidate for the program. How long before I hear back? I asked as we watched the clerk process the certified mail. 2 weeks maximum, Marcus replied. But given your situation and my deployment schedule, I've requested expedited processing. We should hear something within a few days. As we walked back to his rental car, I realized that Marcus had been planning this intervention for longer than just the past few days. The housing application had been partially completed before he arrived, suggesting he'd been researching options and building a solution while I'd been spiraling into panic. Why didn't you tell me about this program before? I asked. Marcus stopped walking and turned to face me. Because you wouldn't have listened. Every time anyone in the family tries to help you, you shut down and insist you can handle everything alone. I had to wait until you were desperate enough to accept help without your pride getting in the way. He was right. If he'd called me 3 months ago with this opportunity, I would have thanked him politely and continued struggling on my own, convinced that accepting help would somehow diminish my independence. But desperation had a way of clarifying priorities. As we drove back to my apartment, I found myself actually excited about the possibility of starting over somewhere new, with a support system I'd never had and opportunities I'd never imagined. The phone call came on a Thursday morning while I was serving coffee to the early shift regulars at Rosie's Diner. My manager, Carol, gestured for me to take it in the back office, probably assuming it was another bill collector or family drama. Miss Chen, this is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Hoffman from Coast Guard Housing Services in Seattle. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. I'm calling regarding your application for military family housing assistance. Are you available to discuss the details? My hands started shaking as I grabbed a pen and notepad. Yes, absolutely. Your application has been approved for immediate placement. We have a 2-bedroom unit available in the Lighthouse Harbor Complex in Port Angeles, with move-in availability starting next Monday. The monthly rent will be $450, which includes utilities, internet, and access to all community facilities. Quote, $450. I was currently paying $825 for my cramped Sacramento apartment, not including utilities that ran another $150 during winter months. The financial relief alone would change everything. There are some program requirements we need to discuss, Lieutenant Commander Hoffman continued. Within 30 days of move-in, you'll need to secure employment or enroll in an approved education or training program. You'll also be assigned a family liaison coordinator who will check in monthly and help connect you with local resources. She explained that the complex housed a mix of military families and civilians like me, creating a community environment focused on mutual support and personal development. Residents organized carpools, shared childcare responsibilities, and often helped each other find job opportunities. One more thing, she added before ending the call. Your brother specifically requested that we expedite your case due to housing instability. He's listed as your emergency contact and program sponsor. You're fortunate to have someone advocating for you. After hanging up, I stood in Carol's cluttered office, staring at the notes I'd scribbled. In 5 days, I could be starting a completely new life in Washington State. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Carol found me there 20 minutes later, still processing the news. Everything okay, honey? She asked, her weathered face showing genuine concern. Carol had been managing Rosie's for 15 years and had seen dozens of young employees struggle through various crises. I explained the situation, expecting her to be disappointed about losing a reliable worker on short notice. Instead, she surprised me by pulling out her phone and showing me photos of her own daughter. Emma moved to Portland 3 years ago for a job opportunity, Carol said, scrolling through pictures of a young woman in business attire. Best decision she ever made. Sometimes you have to leave what's familiar to find what's possible. That afternoon, Carol helped me draft a professional resignation letter and even offered to serve as a reference for future employers. Her support meant more than she probably realized. Having someone validate my decision made it feel less like running away and more like moving forward. The next few days blurred together in a whirlwind of packing, paperwork, and awkward conversations with family members. Marcus had returned to Alaska but called every evening to help coordinate logistics. He'd arranged for a Coast Guard Family Assistance Fund to cover my moving expenses and security deposit, presenting it as a standard benefit rather than charity. The conversation with Mom was inevitable, but more painful than I'd expected. When I called to tell her about the housing opportunity, her initial response was silence, followed by a question that revealed how little she understood about my situation. So you're running away to live in some kind of military compound? Her tone carried the disapproval I'd grown accustomed to over the years. I'm moving to subsidized housing that will allow me to save money while building a career, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Marcus helped me find an opportunity that actually leads somewhere. Well, I hope you know what you're doing, she said, and I could hear Frank's voice in the background making comments I couldn't quite make out. Don't expect us to rescue you when this doesn't work out either. The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. She was warning me not to expect rescue from the same people who had just refused to rescue me. Marcus called that evening, somehow sensing that I'd spoken with Mom. How bad was it? He asked without preamble. She thinks I'm making a mistake and that I'll come crawling back when it fails, I said, surprised by how much her lack of support still hurt. Madison, do you remember when I first told the family I was joining the Coast Guard? Marcus asked. Dad said I was throwing my life away, and Mom cried for a week because she thought I'd never amount to anything in the military. I did remember. Our parents had painted Marcus's enlistment as a desperate move by someone who couldn't succeed in the civilian world. Now they bragged about him constantly, conveniently forgetting their initial opposition. Sometimes the people who claim to love us are the least equipped to see our potential, Marcus continued. They're so invested in keeping us small and manageable that they can't imagine us succeeding beyond their limitations. His words helped, but the family dynamics still stung. I was about to make the biggest positive change of my adult life, and the people who should have been celebrating were treating it like another failure. Moving day arrived faster than expected. I'd hired a small moving company to transport my belongings to Washington, keeping only what would fit in my car for the drive north. As I loaded the last boxes, Mr. Peterson appeared with my security deposit refund, something I'd never expected to see. Your brother made quite an impression, he said, handing me an envelope. He suggested that keeping good relationships with former tenants was better business than keeping deposits for normal wear and tear. Even from hundreds of miles away, Marcus was still smoothing the path for my transition. The drive to Port Angeles took 8 hours, winding through California's Central Valley, then up through Oregon's forests and into Washington's coastal region. With each mile, I felt the weight of Sacramento's financial stress lifting from my shoulders. I wasn't running away from problems. I was driving towards solutions. I reached the Lighthouse Harbor complex just before sunset, and my first impression took my breath away. The buildings were modern and well-maintained, surrounded by landscaped gardens and walking paths. Children played in a central courtyard while their parents chatted on nearby benches. It looked like the kind of community I'd seen in magazines but never imagined living in. The complex manager, a retired Navy petty officer named Tom Rodriguez, met me at the main office with my keys and a welcome packet filled with local information. Your brother called yesterday to make sure everything was ready, Tom said as we walked toward my building. He wanted me to tell you that he's proud of you for taking this step. My apartment was on the second floor, with large windows facing west toward the Olympic Mountains. The rooms were bright and spacious, with newer appliances and fresh paint throughout. Standing in my empty living room, looking out at the mountain views, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope for the future. That night, I called Marcus from my new kitchen, surrounded by unpacked boxes but feeling more at home than I had in Sacramento. The place is incredible, I told him. I can't believe this is my life now. It's just the beginning, Marcus replied. Tomorrow you start building something that's actually yours. Not just surviving, but thriving. My first week in Port Angeles unfolded like a completely different life. Instead of waking up to the sound of sirens and traffic, I opened my eyes to birds chirping outside my bedroom window. The mountain air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine trees and ocean salt. For the first time in years, I wasn't calculating rent money before my feet hit the floor. The family liaison coordinator, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, knocked on my door Tuesday morning with a stack of local resources and job leads. Jennifer was a Coast Guard spouse who'd transitioned into community outreach after her husband's retirement, and she understood the challenges of starting over in a new place. The key is not to overwhelm yourself, she said as we sat at my kitchen table, reviewing employment opportunities. You have 30 days to find work, but most residents secure positions within the first 2 weeks. She'd already contacted 3 restaurants in downtown Port Angeles that were actively hiring experienced servers. The pay scales started at $15 per hour, nearly double what I'd been making in Sacramento, with tips and benefits packages that included health insurance and paid vacation time. There's also the Olympic Community College Extension Program, Jennifer added, sliding a brochure across the table. They offer evening classes in business administration, healthcare, and hospitality management. Several residents are working full-time while earning certificates that lead to better career opportunities. The idea of going back to school had never seemed financially possible before. Between rent, utilities, and basic survival needs, I'd never had the time or money to invest in education. But with housing costs cut in half and better-paying jobs available, continuing education suddenly became a realistic option. That afternoon, I walked downtown to explore the job opportunities Jennifer had mentioned. Port Angeles was nothing like Sacramento. Smaller, quieter, with local businesses that seemed to value their employees rather than treating them as replaceable parts. The downtown area stretched along the waterfront, with views of the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the Canadian mountains beyond. My first interview was at a restaurant called the Crab House, a locally owned seafood place that catered to both tourists and locals. The manager, a middle-aged woman named Diana Chang, reviewed my work history and seemed impressed by my experience and reliability. "We're looking for someone who can handle busy nights and work well with a small team," Diana explained. "The position starts at $16 an hour plus tips, with health insurance after 90 days and 2 weeks paid vacation after a year." The job offer was better than anything I'd ever been offered before, but Diana suggested I interview at the other restaurants as well to make sure I found the right fit. Her encouragement to explore options rather than jumping at the first offer was another sign of how different this community was from what I'd known. The Blue Moon Cafe specialized in breakfast and lunch, with a cozy atmosphere and regular customers who knew each other by name. The Olympic Lodge offered fine dining with higher tip potential but more demanding service standards. Each place had its advantages, but they all offered something I'd never experienced: employers who seemed to view their staff as valuable team members rather than interchangeable labor. By Friday, I'd received job offers from all 3 restaurants. After weighing the options, I chose the Crab House because Diana's management style reminded me of the best aspects of working with Carol, but with better pay and benefits. My start date was set for the following Monday. That weekend, I began to explore the broader community around Lighthouse Harbor. The complex organized weekend activities for residents, hiking groups, movie nights, shared dinners in the community center. It was a level of social connection I'd never experienced as an adult, where neighbors actually knew each other and looked out for one another. I joined a Saturday morning hiking group led by a retired Coast Guard chief named Mike Thompson and his wife Laura. They'd been living in the complex for 3 years, while Mike finished a degree in environmental science at the local college extension. Their story was familiar: military family transitioning to civilian life with the help of the housing program, but their success was inspiring. "The program gave us time to figure out what came next," Laura explained as we walked along a trail overlooking the harbor. "Without worrying about rent eating up most of our income, Mike could go to school and I could start my photography business." She showed me photos on her phone of local landscapes and events she'd been hired to document. What started as a hobby had grown into a profitable small business, something that wouldn't have been possible if they'd been struggling with high housing costs. During the hike, I met other residents who were using the program's stability to build better futures. There was Angela, a single mother completing her nursing degree while working part-time at the local hospital. Robert, a Navy veteran who'd started an IT consulting business from his apartment. Sarah, who'd used the time and financial breathing room to earn her teaching certificate and now worked at the elementary school. The common thread among all of them was that the housing program hadn't just provided cheap rent, it had provided the foundation for pursuing goals that seemed impossible when survival took all their energy and resources. Marcus called that Sunday evening to check on my progress. When I told him about the job offer and the community I was discovering, his voice carried a satisfaction I'd rarely heard from him. "You sound different," he said. "Happier, more like the person I remember from before everything got so hard." He was right. The constant stress of financial instability had changed me over the years, making me defensive and isolated. Here in Port Angeles, surrounded by people who understood the challenges of rebuilding and supported each other's progress, I was rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. "I've been thinking about taking some business classes," I told him. Jennifer mentioned that several people have started their own small businesses after completing the certificate program. "What kind of business?" Marcus asked, and I could hear genuine interest in his voice. "Maybe catering or a small cafe," I said, surprised by my own words. I've been cooking professionally for 4 years, and I love the creative side of menu planning and food preparation. The restaurant scene here is good, but there's definitely room for more options. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Marcus helping me think through the practical steps of turning a vague dream into a concrete plan. He'd learned strategic planning in the Coast Guard, and he applied those skills to help me map out potential pathways from server to business owner. The best part is that you have time to plan properly, he said. You're not making desperate decisions anymore, you can make strategic ones. That night, I sat on my balcony looking out at the harbor lights, thinking about how dramatically my life had changed in just 2 weeks. The same time it had taken for my eviction notice to expire had been enough to completely transform my circumstances and outlook. The irony wasn't lost on me that losing my apartment in Sacramento, the thing I'd been so desperate to prevent, had been the catalyst for finding something infinitely better. Sometimes what feels like failure is actually the universe pushing you toward opportunities you never would have discovered otherwise. 3 months into my new life in Port Angeles, I experienced something I'd forgotten was possible. I had money left over after paying bills. Not just a few dollars, but actual savings accumulating in my bank account each month. The financial stability felt surreal after years of constant worry about making ends meet. Working at the Crab House exceeded all my expectations. Diana had become more than just a manager. She was a mentor who encouraged my creativity in the kitchen and trusted me with increasingly complex responsibilities. When the weekend prep cook quit unexpectedly, she offered me additional hours helping with food preparation, which meant learning skills beyond serving tables. You have a natural instinct for flavor combinations, Diana told me one busy Saturday as I finished preparing the day's special sauce. Have you ever considered culinary school? The suggestion planted a seed that grew stronger each day. Olympic Community College offered a culinary arts program with evening classes designed for working professionals. The program would take 2 years to complete, but the financial stability I'd found in Port Angeles made it actually achievable. I enrolled in my first business administration class in November, testing the waters before committing to the full culinary program. Professor Martinez was a retired restaurant owner who brought real-world experience to every lesson. The class was small, 12 students, most of them adults like me, who were rebuilding their careers with the help of various assistance programs. Starting a business requires 3 things, Professor Martinez explained during our first session. A solid product or service, understanding of your market, and enough capital to survive the learning curve. Most people fail because they skip the planning phase and jump straight to the execution. His words resonated deeply. My entire adult life had been about jumping from crisis to crisis without any long-term planning. The stability I'd found in Port Angeles was giving me something I'd never had before, the luxury of making thoughtful, strategic decisions about my future. The community at Lighthouse Harbor continued to surprise me with opportunities for growth and connection. When Laura Thompson organized a holiday potluck in December, I volunteered to coordinate the food preparation. The event became a showcase for my developing culinary skills, with neighbors raving about the dinner rolls and apple tart I'd contributed. "These are restaurant quality," said Mrs. Henderson, an elderly resident whose husband was a retired Coast Guard captain. "You should consider catering local events." The compliment was casual, but it sparked a serious conversation with Jennifer Walsh during our monthly check-in meeting. She explained that several residents had started small businesses using their apartments as home bases, taking advantage of the program's flexibility around entrepreneurial activities. "The complex has commercial kitchen space available for resident use," Jennifer mentioned, pulling out information I'd never seen before. "It was originally designed for large community events, but residents can reserve time for small catering jobs or food preparation businesses." The commercial kitchen was a revelation: professional-grade equipment, ample prep space, and all the certifications needed for food service businesses. The rental fee was modest, especially when compared to the cost of commercial kitchen space in larger cities. By January, I developed a business plan for a small catering operation, specializing in coastal cuisine with fresh local ingredients. Professor Martinez helped me refine the financial projections and marketing strategy, while Diana offered to serve as a professional reference and informal advisor. Marcus visited for the first time in February, taking leave to see how I was settling into my new life. Walking through downtown Port Angeles with him, showing him the restaurant where I worked, and the college where I was taking classes, I felt pride in my accomplishments for the first time in years. "This place suits you," he said as we sat at a waterfront cafe watching ferries cross the strait. "You seem more like yourself than you have since high school." He was right. The constant financial stress had stripped away my confidence and creativity, leaving me focused solely on survival. In Port Angeles, surrounded by supportive community and stable housing, I was rediscovering interests and abilities I'd forgotten I possessed. "I've been thinking about the catering business seriously," I told him, showing him the business plan I'd developed. "I could start small, maybe just weekend events and private dinners, while keeping my restaurant job for steady income." Marcus reviewed my projections with the analytical skills he'd developed in the Coast Guard. His feedback was constructive and encouraging, helping me identify potential challenges while validating the viability of my plan. "You'll need startup capital for equipment and initial marketing," he noted. "Have you looked into small business loans or grants for veterans' family members?" He introduced me to resources I'd never known existed, programs specifically designed to help military families start small businesses, with favorable loan terms and mentorship opportunities. The Coast Guard Family Assistance Foundation offered microgrants for family members pursuing entrepreneurship, and several local banks had partnership programs with reduced fees and flexible payment structures. The most significant development came during Marcus's visit when he met with Tom Rodriguez, the complex manager, to discuss long-term housing options. The conversation revealed information that changed my entire perspective on the program. "Madison's been such a positive addition to our community," Tom told Marcus during their meeting. "She's exactly the kind of resident we hope to transition from temporary assistance to permanent community membership." He explained that successful program participants could eventually qualify for rent-to-own arrangements, building equity in their apartments while maintaining the community benefits. The transition typically happened after 2 years of stable employment and community involvement, with the purchase price reflecting the residents' investment in the complex. "Essentially, you could own your own place here within 5 years," Marcus explained to me later. "Not just rent stability, but actual property ownership." The possibility of homeownership had seemed impossible during my years in Sacramento. Here in Port Angeles, it was becoming a realistic 5-year goal, supported by the community connections and business opportunities I was developing. That evening, Marcus and I called our parents together for the first time since I'd moved to Washington. The conversation was awkward but revealing, showing how differently they responded to success versus struggle. "So you're really doing well up there?" Mom asked, her tone suggesting surprise that I was thriving without her input or assistance. "Better than I ever did in California," I replied honestly. "I'm saving money, taking college classes, and planning to start my own business." The silence that followed was telling. When I'd been struggling and asking for help, they'd treated me like a burden. Now that I was succeeding independently, they seemed unsure how to respond to my progress. Frank's voice came through the background, asking about my living situation in what he probably thought was a whisper. Mom's response was audible. "It's some kind of military housing thing that Marcus arranged." The dismissive tone stung, but it also clarified something important. My family's inability to support my growth wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a limitation of their perspective and priorities. After ending the call, Marcus and I sat quietly on my balcony, processing the interaction. "They're never going to understand what you've accomplished here," he said finally, "but that doesn't make it less real or important." His words released something I'd been holding onto without realizing it, the need for parental approval and recognition. My success in Port Angeles was mine to own and celebrate, regardless of whether my family could appreciate it. Spring in Port Angeles brought more than just blooming flowers and warmer weather. It brought the launch of Madison's Coastal Catering. After months of planning, permit applications, and equipment purchases, I served my first official catering event in April, a retirement party for one of Tom Rodriguez's friends from his Navy days. The event was small, just 30 people, but it represented everything I'd worked towards since arriving in Washington. The menu featured Pacific Northwest favorites with my own creative touches: cedar plank salmon with blackberry glaze, Dungeness crab cakes with lemon aioli, and wild mushroom risotto made with locally foraged chanterelles. "This is incredible," said the guest of honor, Captain Williams, as he sampled the salmon. Where did you train? Life, I replied with a smile, thinking about all the double shifts at Rosie's Diner that had taught me speed and efficiency, and the months at the Crab House where Diana had encouraged my creativity. The evening was a complete success, generating 3 additional bookings before I'd even finished cleaning up. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit military community, and by May I was averaging 2 events per weekend while still working part-time at the restaurant. The commercial kitchen at Lighthouse Harbor became my second home. During the week, I'd prep ingredients and test new recipes, while weekends were devoted to executing events. The space was perfect for my needs, large enough to handle substantial orders, but intimate enough that I never felt overwhelmed by the scale. My fellow residents became my biggest supporters and unofficial marketing team. Angela, the nursing student, recommended my services to her hospital colleagues for their summer barbecue. Robert's IT consulting clients hired me for their annual conference dinner. Sarah arranged for me to cater the elementary school's teacher appreciation luncheon. You're creating a brand reputation without even trying, Professor Martinez observed during one of our monthly business mentoring sessions. That's the power of community-based marketing. People trust recommendations from neighbors they respect. By June, Madison's coastal catering had evolved beyond weekend events. I'd negotiated a contract with the local visitors center to provide boxed lunches for tour groups, and 2 downtown businesses hired me for regular employee catering. The steady income allowed me to reduce my restaurant hours to just 2 shifts per week, giving me more time to focus on growing the business. The financial transformation was remarkable. Instead of living paycheck to paycheck, I was building legitimate savings while investing in business equipment and supplies. My monthly income had tripled since Sacramento, but more importantly, I was building something sustainable rather than just surviving. Marcus visited again in July, this time bringing his girlfriend Sarah, a Coast Guard pilot he'd met during a joint training exercise. Watching them together, I realized how much my brother had grown and matured since joining the service. The military had given him confidence and purpose, just as Port Angeles had done for me. I want to show you something, I said after dinner at my apartment, leading them to the commercial kitchen where I'd been preparing for a weekend wedding. The space buzzed with organized activity. Sheet pans of marinated vegetables, sauces reducing on multiple burners, and careful notes tracking every element of the next day's menu. It was controlled chaos that would have overwhelmed me a year earlier, that now felt like conducting a familiar orchestra. Madison, this is a real operation, Sarah said, her pilot's eye taking in the precision and planning evident throughout the kitchen. How many people are you feeding tomorrow? 120, I replied, checking the timing schedule I'd posted on the wall. It's my biggest event yet. A military wedding at Fort Worden State Park. The bride specifically requested local Pacific Northwest cuisine. Marcus picked up my event planning binder, flipping through pages of detailed timelines, supplier contacts, and menu variations I'd developed over the past few months. His expression showed the same pride I'd seen when he talked about his Coast Guard accomplishments. You've built something real here, he said quietly. This isn't just a job, it's a career. The wedding went flawlessly, despite a brief panic when the delivery truck bringing my rental tables arrived an hour late. The experience taught me valuable lessons about backup planning and vendor relationships, while the client's enthusiastic review led to 3 more wedding bookings before summer's end. August brought an unexpected opportunity when Diana approached me with a proposal. The Crab House's owner was considering expanding to include a catering division, and Diana recommended me as the ideal person to develop and manage the new service. We'd provide the initial investment, kitchen space, and marketing support, Diana explained over coffee one morning. You'd maintain your independent business, but partner with us for larger events and corporate contracts we can't currently accommodate. The partnership offer represented a significant step up in scale and legitimacy. The Crab House had an established reputation and existing relationships with hotels, event venues, and corporate clients. Partnering with them would accelerate my business growth while providing financial security. But it also meant giving up some independence and creative control. The restaurant's owners would expect consistent profitability and adherence to their brand standards. After building Madison's coastal catering from nothing, the idea of sharing control felt uncomfortable. I discussed the opportunity with Jennifer Walsh during our monthly check-in, approaching it as both a business decision and a personal growth challenge. What does your gut tell you? Jennifer asked after reviewing the partnership terms. That I'm scared of making the wrong choice, I admitted. 6 months ago, I would have jumped at any opportunity for stability. Now I'm worried about giving up the freedom I've worked so hard to create. Jennifer smiled. That's growth. You're thinking strategically instead of reactively. Take time to evaluate whether this partnership moves you toward your long-term goals or just provides short-term security. I spent 2 weeks researching the decision, consulting with Professor Martinez, reviewing my business projections, and honestly assessing my capacity for growth. The conclusion surprised me. I was ready for the challenge, but only on terms that preserved my creative independence and long-term business ownership. My counter-offer to Diana and the Crab House owners reflected this clarity. Instead of a traditional partnership where they'd own part of my business, I proposed a preferred vendor relationship. They'd guarantee me a certain amount of monthly catering business and provide kitchen space during busy periods, while I maintained full ownership and creative control of Madison's Coastal Catering. You drive a hard bargain, Diana said when I presented the terms, but her smile suggested approval rather than disappointment. I like that you know what you want and aren't afraid to ask for it. The negotiation process revealed how much I'd changed since arriving in Port Angeles. Instead of accepting whatever was offered out of desperation or gratitude, I was advocating for terms that supported my long-term success. The housing program had given me more than financial stability. It had given me the confidence to value my own contributions and negotiate accordingly. September brought the finalization of our agreement and my first major corporate event under the new arrangement. The Pacific Northwest Tourism Board hired the Crab House to cater their annual conference, with Madison's Coastal Catering handling the execution. 200 attendees, 3 days of meals, and a showcase opportunity that could lead to significant future business. The event exceeded everyone's expectations, generating positive feedback that reached tourism officials throughout the region. Within a month, I'd received inquiries from organizations in Seattle, Tacoma, and Vancouver, all seeking coastal cuisine catering for their events. Standing in my apartment that October evening, looking out at the harbor lights while reviewing the stack of business inquiries on my kitchen table, I realized I'd achieved something I'd never dared to dream during my Sacramento years. Financial independence built on work I genuinely loved. The transformation from desperate eviction notice to thriving business owner had taken exactly 1 year. But more than the external changes, the stable housing, growing income, and expanding opportunities, I'd rediscovered the person I was meant to become. The confident, creative, ambitious woman who'd been buried under years of financial stress and family disappointment had finally emerged. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Saw the article about your catering business in the Port Angeles newspaper online. Dad forwarded it to me. Mom said she's proud but not surprised, because she always knew you had potential. Face with rolling eyes. I laughed out loud at his eye roll emoji, perfectly capturing my own reaction to our mother's revisionist history. But the family dynamics that had once devastated me now felt like background noise, compared to the real relationships I'd built in Port Angeles. Tomorrow would bring another day of menu planning, client meetings, and the countless small decisions that kept Madison's Coastal Catering growing. But tonight, I allowed myself to savor the quiet satisfaction of having built something meaningful from the ashes of what had seemed like complete failure. The eviction notice that had terrified me 1 year ago was now framed on my office wall, not as a reminder of past struggles, but as proof that sometimes the worst moments in our lives are actually doorways to the best chapters we've yet to write. 2 years after that devastating eviction notice, I stood in the lobby of the Seattle Convention Center, adjusting my chef's jacket while watching hundreds of food industry professionals stream past. The Pacific Northwest Culinary Awards ceremony was about to begin, and Madison's Coastal Catering had been nominated in the Rising Star Catering Company category, an honor that still felt surreal. Madison Chen, a woman with a press badge, approached, extending her hand. I'm Rebecca Martinez from Pacific Northwest Magazine. We've been following your story since the Tourism Board conference. Could we chat for a few minutes about your journey? The interview request was one of many I'd received since Madison's Coastal Catering had expanded beyond Port Angeles. What started as weekend events for military families had grown into a regional operation serving corporate clients from Vancouver to Portland. The business now employed 6 part-time staff members, all residents or former residents of military housing programs like mine. The interesting thing about your business model, Rebecca continued as we found a quiet corner, is how you've maintained community focus while scaling up. Most catering companies either stay small and local or lose their personal touch when they expand. She was referring to something I'd become known for in the industry, using my success to create opportunities for others in similar situations. Every major event I catered included hiring temporary staff from military family housing programs, providing them with professional experience and networking opportunities. Several had gone on to start their own food service businesses or secure permanent positions with established restaurants. It's not charity, I explained, a distinction I'd learned to make clearly. These are talented people who just need opportunities. Military families bring discipline, reliability, and strong work ethics to any team. Employers benefit as much as the workers do. The conversation was interrupted by familiar laughter from across the lobby. Marcus had arrived with Sarah, both in dress uniforms for the ceremony. They'd driven down from his new posting at Coast Guard Sector Seattle, where he'd been promoted to Chief Petty Officer and assigned to search and rescue operations. "There's the famous chef," Marcus said, pulling me into a hug that lifted me off the ground. "Ready for your big night?" The nomination itself was already more recognition than I'd ever expected, but the evening held additional significance. Tom Rodriguez had flown in from Port Angeles, representing the Lighthouse Harbor complex where my transformation had begun. Jennifer Walsh was here too, now promoted to regional coordinator for military family housing programs throughout Washington state. "Win or lose, you've already accomplished something remarkable," Tom said as we gathered for photos before the ceremony. "You've proven that these programs work when participants are ready to embrace change." His words carried weight beyond personal encouragement. My success story had become a case study for military family assistance programs nationwide. Housing coordinators from other bases had visited Port Angeles to study the Lighthouse Harbor model, and several had implemented similar community-focused approaches based partly on my recommendations. The ceremony began with a reception featuring dishes from nominated caterers. Walking through the displays, I felt a mix of pride and nervousness seeing Madison's Coastal Catering represented alongside companies that had been established for decades. My contribution was a signature dish that had become popular at corporate events: wild salmon Wellington with Dungeness crab stuffing and huckleberry reduction. "This is exceptional," said Chef Raymond Morrison, the ceremony's keynote speaker and owner of 3 acclaimed Seattle restaurants. "The flavor combinations are sophisticated but not pretentious." "Where did you train?" It was the same question I'd been asked countless times, and my answer always surprised people. When I explained my background, the years struggling in Sacramento, the eviction that led to military housing, the community support that enabled my education, Chef Morrison's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine engagement. "So you're entirely self-taught?" he asked. "That's remarkable. Would you be interested in a consulting opportunity? I'm developing a program to mentor emerging culinary entrepreneurs, particularly those from non-traditional backgrounds." The conversation planted seeds for future collaboration, but it was interrupted by the announcement that dinner service was beginning. As guests moved toward their tables, I spotted an unexpected face in the crowd, Diana Chang from the Crab House, dressed elegantly and wearing a proud smile. "I couldn't miss this," she said, hugging me warmly. "You've come so far from that nervous girl who interviewed with me 3 years ago." Diana's presence meant more than any award could. She'd been the first person in Port Angeles to see potential in me beyond just another struggling server. Her mentorship and the opportunities she'd provided had been crucial stepping stones in building my business. The dinner conversation at our table wove together threads from different chapters of my journey. Marcus shared stories about Coast Guard operations that had taught him leadership skills he now applied in civilian life. Sarah discussed her transition from active duty to the reserves, balancing her pilot career with her new role as a flight instructor at a civilian aviation school. Jennifer Walsh described the expansion of military family housing programs, crediting success stories like mine for securing additional funding and support. Tom Rodriguez talked about the Lighthouse Harbor Complex's evolution into a model community that other bases were replicating. The key insight, Jennifer explained to the table, is that housing stability alone isn't enough. It's the community support, educational opportunities, and business development resources that create lasting change. When the awards ceremony began, I found myself surprisingly calm. The nomination had already opened doors and created connections that would benefit my business for years to come. Whether I won felt less important than the recognition of how far I'd traveled from that desperate night in Sacramento. The Rising Star category was announced third, with 5 nominees representing innovative approaches to catering and food service. As the presenter read each company's achievements, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. 3 years ago, I'd been 22 years old, working 60-hour weeks for barely enough money to survive, convinced that struggling alone was the same as being independent. Tonight, I was 25, employing others, contributing to my community, and building something sustainable that extended far beyond my own needs. And the winner of the Rising Star Catering Company Award is, the presenter paused dramatically, Madison's Coastal Catering, for innovative community-focused business development and exceptional culinary achievement. The applause felt distant as I walked to the stage, still processing that my name had actually been called. The Crystal Award was heavier than I expected, engraved with words that would have seemed impossible during my darkest moments in Sacramento. Excellence in Entrepreneurship. My acceptance speech was brief, focusing on gratitude for the community support that had made everything possible. But the real impact came afterward, during the reception, when I was approached by representatives from 3 different organizations interested in partnership opportunities. A Seattle-based hotel chain wanted to discuss exclusive catering contracts for their conference facilities. A nonprofit focused on veteran services asked about developing a culinary training program for transitioning military families. A venture capital firm specializing in food service businesses requested a meeting to discuss expansion funding. Each conversation represented potential growth directions I could never have imagined. But they also brought back memories of earlier opportunities I'd been too desperate to evaluate properly. This time I had the luxury of careful consideration, weighing each option against my long-term goals rather than immediate survival needs. The drive back to Port Angeles the next morning gave me time to process the evening's developments. Marcus and Sarah followed in their car, planning to spend the weekend exploring the Olympic Peninsula before returning to Seattle. Having them see my life in Port Angeles felt important, a chance to show them the community that had nurtured my growth. We stopped at the Crab House for lunch, where Diana had prepared a celebration meal featuring dishes that marked different stages of my culinary development. The salmon with blackberry glaze from my first catering event. The Dungeness crab cakes that had become my signature appetizer. New creations I'd developed for recent corporate clients. "This is like eating your autobiography," Sarah observed, tasting each dish thoughtfully. "Every flavor tells part of your story." After lunch, we toured the Lighthouse Harbor Complex, where Tom Rodriguez proudly showed Marcus and Sarah the commercial kitchen that had incubated my business. Several current residents stopped to congratulate me on the award, their enthusiasm reflecting the community investment in each member's success. "Your sister has inspired a lot of people here," Tom told Marcus as we walked through the community garden that residents had expanded over the past year. "We've had 3 other food service businesses start up, plus a cleaning service, a childcare cooperative, and an IT consulting firm. Success breeds success in a supportive environment." That evening, we gathered in my apartment for a quiet dinner I'd prepared using ingredients from the community garden and local suppliers I'd built relationships with over the past 2 years. The conversation flowed easily, covering everything from Marcus's Coast Guard experiences to Sarah's aviation career to my business plans. "I've been thinking about the expansion opportunities," I said as we lingered over dessert and coffee. "The hotel chain contract would guarantee steady income, but it might limit my creative freedom. The nonprofit partnership could create meaningful impact but lower profitability. The venture capital option offers the fastest growth but requires giving up some control." Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering my dilemma with the strategic thinking the Coast Guard had taught him. "What feels most aligned with why you started this business in the first place?" The question cut straight to the heart of my decision-making process. Madison's coastal catering hadn't begun as a pursuit of wealth or fame. It had emerged from a desire to create something meaningful while building financial independence. The success felt most satisfying when it enabled opportunities for others facing similar challenges. The nonprofit partnership, I said, surprising myself with the clarity of my response. Working with transitioning military families combines everything I'm passionate about: culinary arts, community development, and creating pathways for people who've been overlooked. Sarah nodded approvingly. Military families have skills that civilian employers often don't recognize. A training program that translates military experience into food service credentials could benefit everyone involved. The conversation continued late into the evening, evolving from career planning to broader reflections on family, community, and the unexpected directions life can take. At one point, Marcus brought up our parents, who had finally acknowledged my success but still seemed puzzled by the path I'd taken. "Mom told me she always knew you'd figure things out eventually," he said with a wry smile. Apparently, she's conveniently forgotten about refusing to help with rent 3 years ago. The family dynamics still stung occasionally, but they'd lost their power to define my self-worth. The relationships I'd built in Port Angeles, with mentors like Diana and Tom, supporters like Jennifer, and colleagues throughout the region, had shown me what healthy encouragement and investment looked like. I used to think their approval was necessary for my success, I reflected. Now I realize their limitations aren't about me. They're about their own fears and narrow perspective on what constitutes achievement. As Marcus and Sarah prepared to leave the next morning, I stood on my balcony watching the early ferry cross the strait toward Victoria. The view had become a daily reminder of how far I'd traveled, both geographically and personally, since that desperate night in Sacramento. My phone buzzed with text messages from colleagues congratulating me on the award, clients inquiring about future events, and potential partners interested in collaboration. Each notification represented opportunities that had emerged from the foundation of stability and community support I'd found in Port Angeles. But the most meaningful message came from an unexpected source: a young woman named Elena, who'd just moved into Lighthouse Harbor with her 2 children after her Navy husband's deployment ended. Jennifer Walsh had given her my contact information, suggesting that my experience might provide useful guidance for her transition. "Hi Madison," her text read. "I heard about your catering business and wondered if you might have time to share some advice. I used to work in restaurant management before military moves disrupted my career. Now I'm trying to figure out how to rebuild in a new place. Would you be willing to meet for coffee?" Reading her message, I felt the circle completing itself. 3 years ago, I'd been the desperate newcomer hoping someone would offer guidance and opportunity. Now I was in a position to provide both, using my success to create pathways for others facing similar challenges. I typed back immediately. "I'd love to meet. How about tomorrow at 10 a.m. at Blue Moon Cafe downtown? And don't worry about rebuilding. Sometimes starting over in a new place is exactly what leads to the best chapters of our lives." Setting my phone aside, I looked out at the mountains and harbor that had become home, thinking about the eviction notice still framed on my office wall. That piece of paper had felt like an ending when I first received it, but it had actually been a beginning, the moment when my real life finally started. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight I was content to savor the quiet satisfaction of having built something meaningful from the ashes of what had seemed like complete failure. The scared, struggling girl who'd packed her belongings into garbage bags 3 years ago had become a confident businesswoman, community leader, and mentor to others walking similar paths. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't happened alone. It required the vision of a brother who refused to accept his sister's defeat, the structure of a program designed to nurture rather than just house, and a community that invested in each member's success. Most importantly, it required my own willingness to accept help, and then use that foundation to build something bigger than myself. As the sun set over the Olympic Mountains, painting the harbor in shades of gold and pink, I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast to all the unexpected turns that had led me home. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.